Hi, thanks for joining me today. I'm going to talk about a book that I just finished, and this book is called The Confessions by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, this is one of my favorite books. I've read it many decades ago, and this is a reread for me, and I still enjoyed it, and I'm going to talk about the reasons why I enjoy this Confessions. The version I read was an Oxford World's Classic. Like most of these classics, they have an introduction. This one by Patrick Coleman. And first off, I want to say very carefully, if you've never read this book, do not read this introduction. This is an academic introduction. It loads you down with way too much information. Very detailed, very hypercritical evaluation of Rousseau and this book and all the intricate meanings of the book. It's absolutely ridiculous that anybody would read this before a first read. This introduction is about as valuable as a sock full of dog hair. It's biased. If you're a regular reader, an undergraduate, a master's student, I would not even read this. It ruins the book. I read the book, which is what my pattern is, to read the book and then go back and read the introduction. I did that and I enjoyed the book. And then I went back and read the introduction and I thought, why would I want to read this book? It left me feeling like the book wasn't worth reading. So definitely skip the introduction, okay? I wish I didn't have to start on such a negative note, but it's a warning to people. Anyway, let's move on. This is Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions. So, of course, it's an autobiography of his life. He was born in what is now called Switzerland, and it talks about his family. His mother died when he was born. Talks about a relationship with his father, his education. He was going to be an apprentice, but he couldn't stand it, so he ran away. Then he met a woman who took him into her home, and he was educated there and had a close relationship with her. And as he educated, he just really reading a lot. At a certain point, he got an interest in music. So then he developed his interest in music. He lived out in nature. So that's a fundamental thing to remember, is that he grew up in a rural area in the mountains. So that comes in, that's a very important part of it. He liked to walk a lot. He talks about specifics of relationships with men and women. Then he went to Paris, and he became a copyist of music. The music was very popular in Paris, so he would copy the music out for the musicians. Then he met Diderot, and Diderot asked him to write some entries in his encyclopedia on the subject of music. So then he became a writer. Now his friendships with the philosophers around Diderot's circle increased. He wrote some notable books that were controversial. Then he got introduced to the salons of Paris and all the nobility. So you see him changing from a kind of a simple non-entity living near Geneva to interacting with noble people, aristocracy in Paris. He wrote an opera which was successful, and the king liked it. The king offered him a pension, and Rousseau rejected the pension. He goes into great detail about why he rejected it. He wanted to remain true to his own self. He didn't want to have any obligations to the King of France. He wrote more, and there's some things about the financial worries that he had, some details about publishing his books. He wrote these books that were critical of the nobility, and so they started started to rethink their relationship to him because they were offended by his criticisms. So then he had some conflicts even with the philosophers, and he left Paris. And like I said, at this point, I think an important point is when a person, when a person grows up outside of a city and then moves into a city, two things can happen. One, they will embrace the city sophistication and the society, or in Rousseau's case, it always repulsed him. The corruption of the city, the decadence of the city, the fakeness of the people, he didn't like that, and so you could see it, you could feel it in his writings. So then he left the city, but some rich people were still sponsoring him and letting them live in living in their expensive homes. So he did that. He wrote a book called Emile, which was about the education of Emile. The basic premise is having a natural education for a child, but at the time, the education was based on religion and the Catholic Church. So the people in the Catholic Church were offended by that. So he just started getting all these enemies, and he was persecuted and kind of went in exile. So to me, that's all you need to know before you read it. And you don't even need to know that. Just pick it up and read it. Because as I'm going to emphasize in this video, the most important thing about this book is the writing. It's beautiful writing. One of the reasons why I elevate this book so high is because of the quality of the writing. Rousseau was a musician and a composer. He knew the importance of rhythm and melody, and his words have a sonorous quality that creates a musicality that is individual to him. And I find that that his writing activates parts of my mind similar to the way that music activates parts in my mind. When a person writes an autobiography, of course they're going to present themselves in the way they want to present themselves. Some authors always show themselves as the smartest person and the greatest person ever. They all create a character. And I love this guy. I love this character that he creates. Is it true or not true? I like it. I like the character. I believe the character and everything he does. Now, one of the main things that you'll notice in this this character, Rousseau, is he's so emotional. And his writing is so emotional and based on senses and imagery. One of the things I want to discuss is that it took him many years to write this book, but it was specified that it should be published after his death. Because this book is so emotional, has a very feminine quality to it. And if you read the books that he wrote when he was alive, they're very masculine. He goes head on against the state. He goes head on against inequality, head on against religion in a very masculine, forceful way. But in this book, he's talking about all his emotions and sensitivities and things his friend said and things person gives him a mean look and it says one sentence in a letter, he's offended, and there's all these sensitivities and anxieties that he had. Now, if you're a man, you just don't admit these things when you're alive. You don't admit that somebody offended you because you don't admit another author offends you because something in their book sounds like they're making fun of you. You just don't be so sensitive as a man. They're just taught not to do that. But because this was published after his death, it really is a confession. It's a confession of stupidities, of inane things that he does. It's a confession of failures and regrets. There are many instances of his successes, but he dwells more on the inadequacies. So I found that very outstanding. Just I can't think of another book that comes close to this. At times his nagging complaints are a burden on the reader. But if you really read closely, you see that he's examining these things and he's making conclusions about them. And like when a person says something that offends you, he thinks about where that is coming from, that thought is coming from, and he makes conclusions that seem to me to be very rational conclusions. He presents himself as a very loving and kind person. Now, one of the strengths of Rousseau is his resilience. He tells about his successes and what that meant and what happened, but he's always resilient and thinks of something to do, or somebody comes and helps him and offers him money or offers him a place to stay. So I really admire his characteristic of resilience. Towards the last books, he's writing more and more about his former friends and what's happening. And he's been criticized for being paranoid. So, and I want to talk about this. Paranoia, when I looked up paranoia, it says unfounded belief in persecution. Okay? Unfounded. He talks about all the reasons. Do you know that when he was living in Paris, there was a disagreement because there was a controversy between French music and Italian music. And of course, the French loved the French music, and they had a nationalist pride in their own music from their own country. Whereas Rousseau began his study of music in the rural areas, and he also was a secretary to a diplomat in Venice, where he studied Italian music. So when he came to Paris, he wrote an article about how he preferred Italian music. Well, this offended the French. The pride of the French. You don't want to attack the French music of the mid 1700s. After this was printed, people took sides, and he had some verbal encounters with people. And he even says that at one point, the members of the French opera were trying to assassinate him. And the reason why he knew that was one day he was at the opera, and one of the musketeers, Monsieur Ancelet, escorted Rousseau out of the opera. He found out later that there was going to be an assassination attempt on him, and the musketeer escorted him out and saved his life. Okay? Now, also, later, his first exile from Paris, the authorities in France were so offended by his book that they put an arrest warrant out on him. He was to be arrested. Very serious charge. The people were throwing pebbles at him in the street. At another point, he was living in a house, and it was a quiet day, and all at once, all these rocks were thrown on the roof of the house, and everybody in the house was frightened. So what I'm saying is, when you examine all these real events, he was being persecuted. I reject the idea that he was being paranoid, because he was being persecuted. They were after him. They were gossiping about him. They were planning things against him. They were using innuendo. They were trying to ruin his reputation. I'll tell you another one. He wrote the book called Emile, and while he was waiting for it to be published, another book came out with the same title, Emile. It was written by another author. So then his book came out very soon after, and it appeared like his book was a plagiarism of the other book. So this is the kind of stuff that they were doing to him. Voltaire criticized him. His so-called friends wrote, mocked him. They wrote phony letters to him. So it really upsets me when he gets called paranoid. He was persecuted. That's a real thing. And another thing about this book that's kind of that's more unmanly, is that he often writes in a defensive tone. And to some people, that's very annoying if you're always on the defense. And when you admit anxieties like this, you set yourself up for self-incrimination. But it's just the way he is. And I do think that men don't admit their anxieties the way he does, not when they're alive. This was published after he died. What did he care? He didn't even make any money from it. Why would a person admit all this? He didn't have to do this. But, it's just so full of feeling and sensitivity and a new way of looking at a man that's why I find it one of my favorite books, certainly my favorite book of the 1700s. He admits fumbling social flops. He says when he's socializing with people, the moment I am absolutely obliged to say something, I infallibly utter some stupidity. He also admits a few things that I think authors should hear, because he admits that he finds it difficult to concentrate on any subject for more than 30 minutes at a time. And I find that very interesting, because in my creative endeavors, I go from very short periods of concentration to completely different subjects the next half hour, to a completely different subject the next half hour. And I bounce around to all these things. And rather than think that that's abnormal, I think that is normal for some people. He's a type of person. We're all different types of people. He also says that how important walking was for his thinking. He says his mind worked when he was walking. Because of his matriculation outside of Paris, he appreciated nature. And I think that when a person is raised in a city, they kind of reject nature and they prefer the city life. That's a fundamental aspect of artists that I prefer. They all emphasize their preference for nature over cities. Also, for a writer, he says the study of words poses real problems for one who has no memory. I have never understood the rules of versification. He noticed people were playing cards, and he says gaming is the last resort of the bored. One fault I'll say with him is that he doesn't understand why people would dislike him. When the French started hating him because he preferred Italian music, he didn't really understand why they wouldn't accept his opinion. To me, it's obvious they're just jingoistic, nationalistic thinking that set them off on him. When he criticized the church, he didn't really criticize the church. He just said, I prefer a different type of education than a church education. He didn't realize how much that would offend people. So that is a fault I see in him. I find he always has the interests of the oppressed in mind over the nobility, and that's another reason why they would oppose him, because he's always speaking from the lower classes. Many readers want an authority who never flinches and avoids sentiment and is tough like leather. The Rousseau's writing that was published during his life did not flinch, but in the Confessions, he pivots and shows his Christ-like personality. Thanks for watching.